I'm reading in Exodus 28 and 29 right now, and it's part of all the formality that God institutes for the children of Israel after he gives them the law. And it's like, do this, and if you don't, or if you do it wrong, I will wipe you out. Do this. If you don't do it or do it wrong, you will be cut off from the people. Am I the only one who reads all of this and thinks it's kind of silly? As I read it, I get this image of a medieval bishop with all his silly robes and his silly hat going around with his silly thing with smoke and all of that. And God says, you have to do this to set yourselves apart so that you can approach me. The last one I read, and I don't remember, maybe toward the end of chapter 29, where God has them formulate a perfume. And he says, you can't formulate this perfume for any other purpose. If someone who is not supposed to be using this perfume is caught using this perfume, they've got to be put out of the congregation. Putting all of this together, I think about Moses, who just talked to God. I mean, God gave Moses the law, met him up on Mount Sinai. On the Mount of Transfiguration in the New Testament, Moses and Elijah are there just discussing things with Jesus. None of this silly formality. And there's another place, Psalm 50, and I think this thought also pops up somewhere else, where God says, do you think I want these sacrifices because I'm hungry? I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. If I were hungry, I don't need you to feed me. So why all this silly formality? And I'm convinced it's not for God. It's for his people to be doing these elaborate things to remind them who God is and who they are. We forget so easily. So God has them doing something constantly doing some silly formal thing, so they are constantly aware that God is real and he is their God. And then that perfume thing. I read somewhere that our sense of smell carries with it the greatest sense of memory. There's this old movie I watched about Snowball and Klondike, a couple of orphan polar bears, and they were raised and eventually put into a zoo. And toward the end of the movie, the guy who raised them came to the zoo to see them, and there were, I don't know, 50 people maybe sitting in bleachers watching these polar bears, and the guy is outside a chain link fence, and the one polar bear is suddenly, I mean, this is years later, he smells the guy and he remembers the guy, and he turns and goes up to that chain link fence to see the guy. He picked him out of all of these people because he remembered the smell. So I'm convinced that when people smell that perfume, there is a reminder in their minds. There is one God, and he is our God. I believe all of this formality in the Old Testament is not actually needed for any purpose other than to keep the thought of God in people's minds. And if you hear the lawnmowers going outside, I apologize.